Hi everybody, my name is Matt and today I'm going to be talking about kinesic behavior. I'm going to be doing a section summary in this part of chapter 11 that goes from page 328 to page 333. I'm going to start off just with a general kind of overview of what it is. Kinesics is really the formal study of body movement and body language and kind of how we communicate with each other using our bodies. And the book outlines that there are 5 components to this, so I'm going to be talking about those. There are emblems, there are illustrators, regulators, adapters, and affect displays. So let's get into it. So the next part is about emblems. Emblems are pretty much just movements with your hands or your body in general that kind of show a specific meaning without having to say anything. They stand alone from speech. They are speech-independent gestures, or, as the book says, autonomous gestures. And examples of these things could be the OK sign, the peace sign, scratching your head, moving your shoulders, shrugging them, or dropping your jaw in awe. See, these kind of things basically mean they can communicate something without actually having to say anything to anybody else. Now, the next part of the text talks about how this varies from culture to culture. For example, in the United States, we only have we use less than 100 different emblems, whereas in Israeli culture they use about over 250. There's a little middle paragraph that describes kind of how the meaning for assent is a head nod, which is just this movement going back and forth, whereas in Muslim culture it is a totally different movement but means completely the same thing. And the last part really just discusses a comparison between Colombian and American cultures and emblems, and discovers that there's actually a similarity and that there's a commonality between fist shaking, head nodding, waving goodbye. These things all mean the same thing in both cultures. Okay, and the next part is about illustrators. And illustrators are basic or speech-related gestures are essentially just movements that you make in coordination with speech that are essentially used to kind of clarify what you're saying. Another definition for illustrators could be just that they are used to emphasize and they serve the function of emphasis when you're speaking. This part wasn't very long, but it gave some really great examples, and I found some online through some research. Things like this could be pointing at an object in the room to describe it, describing its size using your hands. One interesting thing that I also found was that politicians kind of use illustrators a lot when they speak, in that when they're emphasizing a point, they have their hand kind of like this, or they're going to be very direct with what they're saying, or they go like this in order to indicate something. And it's just kind of to bring forward some more emphasis. And that's the whole function of illustrators, is they're used to emphasize a point. So the next part is about regulators. Regulators are basically a type of behavior, kinesic behavior, and a movement that is used to initiate turn-taking in a conversation. It's what people use in everyday conversations to switch off, to tell the person to move faster, tell them to reiterate, tell them to stop speaking, tell them to switch places in talking at least. So they're used in a lot of different settings. An example of this could be if your listener is really engaged and they're nodding their head a lot. It usually means that maybe they're about to say something, or if they look kind of gazed and far away, that means that they maybe want you to stop talking so they can say something. So that's kind of the way that regulators work. Another definition for regulators is that they're used to sort of control the pace of a conversation or an exchange between people. Other examples of regulators I found have been facial expressions, like if you're looking confused, or if you're scratching your head, or if you're kind of zoning out. Those are examples of things that could be used to change the pace of a conversation and let the other person speak, etc. The next part is about adapters, and adapters are essentially can be defined as really nervous tics, or things that you do that aren't really meant to communicate anything, but are just kind of like an almost subconscious movement. Now, examples of adapters, there are plenty of examples. You could probably look around any classroom and find them. Examples could be the restless leg syndrome. I know I suffer from that like crazy. There could be tapping a pencil, playing with a pencil, rubbing yourself, itching, adjusting your hair, running your hands through your hair, and anything really that is just sort of like a technique that people use to cope with nervousness. Now, the book really talks about the research that was done into this, and that a lot of people found that these were oftentimes the result of childhood psychological methods of coping with certain things. And there's a psychologist that was named here, Paul Ekman, who I'm going to talk about a little later, who concluded that it could be the result of an evolutionary technique that was used by early animals as a way to retreat or recede. It's called a flight behavior, and it's a similar sort of technique that's used when an animal feels threatened or is feeling kind of nervous at some point. So those are kind of the basics of what a adapter is. Now, the final part in kinesics in chapter 11 is affect displays. So affect displays, as defined in the book, are basically just kind of like kinesic behaviors that are used to show real or faked emotions, and they communicate the emotional state of the person who's displaying them. There are a lot of examples of these things in the text that it gives. Certain things could be such things like moving your feet inward, or kind of just being sort of reserved away, talking with your head down. That kind of thing is an affect display. Or if you have your fists clenched and you're really tense, that could be anger. So those are examples of what affect displays are in the book. The rest of the section really talks about facial expressions, and more importantly, whether being able to identify certain facial expressions is a universal trait amongst all people, or if it's relative to certain cultures or specific to certain cultures and languages. So they use 4 lines of evidence and discuss 4 lines of evidence in the text. The first one is was conducted by the psychologist Paul Ekman mentioned earlier, who did a study on expressions such as happiness, anger, sadness, disgust, depression, these kind of facial expressions, and was trying to see if there was a trend and if they were identifiable within 5 literate cultures. And what he found, because those results were not exactly conclusive, because of mass media being influenced or influencing the results of these 5 cultures, he tested it in New Guinea and found that there was a high cross-cultural accuracy of all these facial expressions. And that was the first line of evidence that he discovered. The second line of evidence comes from research done with blind children, and they actually found that despite the fact that blind children do have a lot of different facial expressions, they usually have more or less the same or similar ways of identifying or displaying emotions using their faces. The third line of evidence comes from non-human primates, and if you've ever been to a zoo, you might notice that monkeys and apes kind of have similar sort of facial movements and ways of expressing themselves, and it's often thought that that's a result of similar evolutionary past to that of humans. And the final line of evidence comes from brain imaging studies, which have found that the area of the brain that is responsible for conducting or creating emotions that result in facial expressions is pretty much the same area in everyone's brain. And the last part, which I thought was really interesting, and this is the last part of the whole section, really talks about cultural variation between expressions such as the smile. Like, an example is that school children in America smile when they get their photo taken, whereas school children in Russia do not. And the final piece that it talks about is the fact that Parisians are often perceived as being rude because they may not smile when they look or make eye contact with a stranger, and that's just because that's the way their culture is, not because they're actually like rude. And so that might lead non-Parisian people to think that, oh, everyone in Paris is a jerk, but that's not really the way it is. So anyway, that concludes my whole video. I hope this was helpful to you guys, and yeah, thanks for watching.